you don't know very much about music. And before you think that that's a very arrogant thing to say, I'm going to also demonstrate how I don't know very much about music either. I'm going to show you a thought experiment that I've done with a lot of groups. This is something that we can think about and we can test out only in our minds because we're going to try to answer a question that's actually impossible to answer. Throughout my career, I've taught music to many different ages. I'm talking kindergarten through graduate school, for one very brief time, all at the same time, which was kind of an unusual experience. But I've done this thought experiment with people of all different ages, and no matter how I do it, I can get more and more interesting answers as they get older, but the reaction to the thought experiment is always surprise. It starts like this. If we take a whiteboard or a blackboard, I can ask everyone in a group to try to name every single genre of music they can think of until they can't do it anymore. Now, typically when I do this with a group of young people, I'll start getting 1,000 different subgenres of rock and 1,000 different subgenres of hip hop. And at a certain point, I'll say, okay, can we just say, let's call all of yacht rock, and we'll take classic rock, and we'll take punk, and we're just gonna call this rock for the sake of time. And then let's continue. How many genres can we really get? And I'll put everything on the board. Then the next thing we do is I draw a big line across the length of the board. And I say, this line represents all of the music that exists in the world. Now already, what does that mean exactly? Does that mean all of the recorded music? Does that mean all of the music, no matter how many times it's being performed by other people? That's a hard question to answer, but for the sake of continuing this thought experiment, let's say it's all of the music that gets created that is more or less original. So if it's a cover of something else, we're going to call that the same piece of music unless there are some drastic, substantial differences. And then we can call that a different piece of music. And then let's count up all of the minutes that are there in those pieces of music. And let's decide how much music is there in the world of each of these genres. We're going to take this timeline and we'll start subdividing it. We'll say, well, how much of this line is rock? How much of it is classical music? We'll start drawing these different sections, and I see what kind of guesses everybody comes up with. And unless I'm talking to a very highly educated musical audience, typically I get these pretty big chunks for all of the music that they're familiar with, all of the music that they've heard on the radio before. A lot of it is for genres that you would hear in top 40 music. And then I'll typically tell them, everything that you've written on the board, with the exception of jazz and classical, I'm going to now combine that into one big genre, and I'm going to show you what this timeline looks like from my perspective. I don't have the right answers either, but I have been studying music for a very long time, and my answer is going to look a little bit different. We're going to take all of these subgenres of things that you've heard on the radio, and I'm just going to call that one gigantic genre of popular music. And on the line that you drew, that section for all of the popular music, that was about 90% of what you thought was out there. I'm going to make that closer to about 10%. Now, when I'm working with young people, immediately the reaction is disbelief. What else is there? What are we missing? If this is all 10%, all of the music that we've ever heard of before, then I'll say, well, let's move on now to jazz. And to jazz, I might give something like 5%. So now, already they're kind of stunned because they don't know much jazz typically. And I'm saying already, well, jazz music is going to account for half of all of the music that they thought was out there already. So let me explain a little bit. I already mentioned we're not going to consider the cover of the same song if it's just about the same, except it's maybe a different singer or some different musicians, but it's the same music. We're not going to consider that to be very different music. But jazz works in a fundamentally different way. If we think about jazz, typically people perform jazz and they're playing music that has been composed by other people. But the part that was pre-composed only accounts for the very beginning and the very end of the piece, that's called the head, and everything else in between is being improvised. So there's a tremendous amount of music that's being created by jazz musicians because jazz musicians tend to also be very prolific. There's many, many jazz recordings and people are constantly creating more and more music. Then I get to the classical section. And the classical section, to a lot of these students' surprises, is even bigger than the popular music section. And they're already thinking, well, how can that be possible? Well, let me explain. First of all, what we're calling classical music is very old. It's going on for hundreds of years. And many of these composers were extremely prolific. Some of them, you could take the amount of works that they created, and if you played it back to back, you'd be listening to music for days and days. I'll give you a couple of examples. First, let's think about Bach, one of the most well-known, important classical music composers. Bach had a position where for 4 years of his life, he was writing a cantata every week. This is a gigantic piece of music typically for choir and orchestra, maybe some soloists. Today, it takes a group of people a pretty long amount of time to learn one of these cantatas. But in Bach's time, he was churning out a new one every week, and on top of that, writing all sorts of various other music, and on top of that, rehearsing and performing and making all of these things come to life. And out of all of those cantatas, we only have about half of them. Many of them are gone. They didn't survive. Here's another example. I'll mention a name that unless you are a real classical music enthusiast, you probably have never heard. The name is Paisiello. Now, before you accuse me of just picking out an arbitrary composer that wasn't very important, and if I start doing that, are we going to start to think about all the music that's being created in everyone's garage? Well, let me explain. Paisiello was thought of as the most important composer of opera during the time of Mozart. Now today, Mozart is thought of as one of the greatest composers of opera, and Paisiello is pretty much forgotten. I've never seen an opera by Paisiello, but during their lifetime, Paisiello was thought of as the most important composer of opera. And this is a list that you're seeing on the screen right now of all of the operas that Paisiello wrote. This doesn't include many, many other works that he wrote. These are just operas. Each one of these lines is about 3+ hours of music. Now, as surprising as this take might be, I still have only counted for about a quarter of all the music that I think is out there. So what is everything else? There's still 75% of it missing. And this is music that here, where I live in the United States, in the Western world, we tend to lump into this giant nebulous category called world music. Human beings have been making music for as long as there have been human beings. We literally have musical instruments that predate our species. There are Neanderthal bone flutes floating around from thousands of years ago. There's an untold amount of music that is constantly being created, and there's extraordinary richness all over the world. A lot of it is quite sophisticated. A lot of it has been very impactful in the world, but you probably just don't know about it. For instance, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of musical instruments. And there's a sophisticated system of Indian classical music, which is typically divided into North Indian or Hindustani music and South Indian Carnatic music. Music in Indonesia has actually completely reshaped music around the world, although many people don't know about it. But I'll tell you briefly that the composer Debussy, who is largely credited with sort of inventing a lot of the music that was going to be anticipated in the 20th century, a lot of his musical style was influenced by a single event. He went to a World's Fair and he saw an Indonesian pavilion where he saw a gamelan, an Indonesian metallophone orchestra, people using mallets to strike instruments that sort of look like xylophones or things that actually kind of look like pots and pans, little metal objects that are struck with mallets, different types of sticks. This completely shattered Debussy's understanding of how music works. The idea that there could be such a completely different conception of music, of tuning, of how instruments relate to each other, of how you can think about harmony. And with that, Debussy took that inspiration, and that further changed the way that people think about music in the world. We live in the very first time in human existence where I can take a globe and I can spin it around, stop it, land on a random country, maybe one that someone's never even heard of, and then I can go quickly within 5 minutes find out what the music sounds like in that country. That is a pretty extraordinary thing. So when I come back to my opening statement, which is that you don't know much about music, and I don't know much about music, this is why. There's simply too much out there for us to ever be able to discover in a single lifetime. But there's also an opportunity there. There is a tremendous amount of music just waiting to be heard and waiting for us to explore and waiting for us to discover all of the richness that human music making has to offer. I hope you've enjoyed this. Please make sure to go ahead and like and subscribe. You can also support the work that I do on Patreon.